April 2nd, 1944, over the green farmland of occupied France, 6 miles south of Amiens. Oberleutnant Franz Dietrich grips the control column of his Focke-Wulf 190, eyes scanning the horizon through breaks in the scattered clouds at 18,000 feet. His mission is simple: escort the fuel convoy moving north toward the Luftwaffe bases near Calais. The morning is quiet. Too quiet. His wingman radios a question about the return route, and Dietrich is about to respond when he sees it. A flicker of movement at 10 o'clock low, climbing fast through a gap in the clouds. He squints. The silhouette is wrong. 2 engines, 2 booms extending back from the wings, a central nacelle hanging between them like some bizarre experiment. For a split second, Dietrich thinks it's a reconnaissance plane, maybe a captured prototype. Then the thing banks hard left, and sunlight catches the white star on its wing. American. What Dietrich doesn't know is that this strange twin-boom fighter has already been tracking his formation for 7 minutes. What he doesn't realize yet is that the pilot in that ungainly machine has both altitude advantage and a plan. And what nobody in the Luftwaffe High Command wants to admit is that this aircraft, the one they dismissed as a reconnaissance curiosity just months ago, is about to rewrite the rules of long-range fighter escort over Europe. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. To understand why it terrified experienced German pilots and frustrated Allied commanders in equal measure, we need to step back to a problem that seemed unsolvable in 1943. The bombers were dying. The 8th Air Force was launching daylight raids deep into Germany. B-17s and B-24s flying in tight formations, relying on their combined defensive firepower to survive. The doctrine said that massed heavy bombers could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. The doctrine was wrong. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, the Americans sent 291 bombers to destroy ball-bearing factories critical to German war production. 60 bombers never came home. Over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The loss rate was 20.6%. Statistically, a crew flying repeated missions had almost no chance of completing their 25-mission tour. The problem was range. American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were formidable in a dogfight, but they couldn't stay with the bombers all the way to targets inside Germany. The P-47 had a combat radius of roughly 230 miles with standard fuel. Munich was 500 miles from English airfields. Berlin was 600, so the bombers flew the last and most dangerous leg alone, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly where to find them. If you're enjoying this breakdown of tactical innovation, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into wartime problem solving. Allied commanders needed a fighter that could escort bombers to any target in the Third Reich and still have fuel to fight on the way home. They needed speed to catch German interceptors. They needed firepower to break up attacks. They needed reliability at altitudes above 25,000 feet where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. And they needed all of this yesterday because bomber crews were dying today. The P-38 Lightning wasn't new. Lockheed designed it back in 1937, before the war even started in Europe. The Army Air Corps wanted an interceptor that could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes and reach 400 miles per hour. Lockheed's solution was radical: twin Allison engines mounted on extended booms, with the pilot sitting in a central nacelle between them. Tricycle landing gear instead of a tailwheel. Concentrated nose armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and 1 20mm cannon, all firing through the propeller arc without synchronization issues. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was complicated. The P-38 entered service in 1941, but early models struggled. The turbo superchargers that gave the engines high-altitude performance were temperamental. In the frigid air above 25,000 feet, engines quit without warning. Pilots reported that the controls became sluggish in high-speed dives, a phenomenon called compressibility that wouldn't be fully understood until after the war. The distinctive twin-boom design made it easy to spot, which meant German pilots learned to recognize it quickly. But the P-38 had one feature that no other American fighter could match in 1943: range. With drop tanks, a Lightning could fly over 450 miles to a target, fight for 15 or 20 minutes, and fly home. That gave it a combat radius approaching 500 miles, nearly double what the P-47 could manage early in the war. For the first time, American fighters could reach into the heart of Germany. The 8th Air Force began deploying P-38 groups to England in late 1943. The 55th Fighter Group arrived in September. The 20th Fighter Group followed in December. Doctrine said these long-range fighters would stay close to the bomber formations, providing a protective umbrella against German attacks. That doctrine was about to be challenged. Major Robert Johnson watches from the cockpit of his P-47 as Messerschmitt 1009s slice through a bomber formation 4,000 feet above him. He's following doctrine, flying within sight of the B-17s, ready to respond to attacks. But the Germans aren't cooperating. They're hitting the bombers from above and behind, diving through the formation at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, firing a quick burst, then using their momentum to climb back out of range before the escorts can react. Johnson radios his flight to climb and intercept. By the time they reach attack altitude, the Messerschmitts are gone, climbing toward the sun or diving away toward the deck. One B-17 is streaming smoke from its number 3 engine. Another has dropped out of formation, losing altitude, an easy target for any German pilot who wants a second pass. The math is brutal. If you wait for the attack to develop, you're always reacting. If you're always reacting, you're always too late. Fighter pilots began to question the close escort doctrine. What if instead of waiting for the Luftwaffe to choose the time and place of battle, American fighters went looking for trouble? What if they ranged ahead of the bombers, climbing to altitude, forcing German fighters to engage before they could organize their attacks? It violated the book. It meant leaving the bombers temporarily undefended. It required fighters with enough fuel to roam, enough speed to catch the enemy, and enough firepower to make them think twice about pressing an attack. The P-38 could do all three, but first, someone had to prove it would work. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins leads the 55th Fighter Group out of their base at Nut Hampstead on January 11, 1944. His orders are standard: escort the bomber stream to Oschersleben, stay within 5 miles of the heavies, engage only if the formation is directly threatened. Jenkins reads the orders twice. Then he calls his squadron commanders together for a briefing. Records suggest that Jenkins proposed a modified approach. He would split his group. One squadron would fly traditional close escort, staying with the bombers. The other 2 squadrons would push ahead, climbing to 28,000 feet, positioning themselves between the bombers and the known Luftwaffe airfields near Brunswick. If German fighters scrambled to intercept, they'd have to go through the P-38s first. If the Lightnings could tie up the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in running battles, the bombers might reach the target unmolested. His operations officer pointed out the risks. If the advanced squadrons ran into heavy resistance, they might burn too much fuel in combat and lack the range to get home. If they guessed wrong about the German approach vector, they'd be out of position and the bombers would be naked. If higher command found out they'd deviated from doctrine, Jenkins could face a court-martial. Jenkins made his decision. They would try it once. If it worked, they'd refine it. If it failed, he'd take the blame. The 55th Fighter Group crosses into German airspace at 0930 hours. Jenkins leads 16 P-38s in the advance element, climbing through 25,000 feet. The sky is crystalline blue, visibility unlimited. Every contrail is visible for 30 miles. Below and behind, the bombers are a distant formation of silver specks, holding their tight boxes, inexorably grinding toward the target. At 27,000 feet, Jenkins spots them, 6 Messerschmitt 109s at Angels 30, 6 miles ahead, flying a racetrack pattern. They're waiting for the bombers, conserving fuel, staying above the fight until the moment they choose to dive. They haven't seen the P-38s yet. The Lightnings are lower, approaching from an unexpected angle, still climbing. Jenkins keys his radio. His voice is calm. He calls vectors to his flight leaders. He tells them to continue climbing to close the distance before the Germans realize they're in a fight. The P-38s have the advantage now, but only for another 60 seconds. At 2 miles, the lead Messerschmitt breaks left. He's seen them. The German formation scatters, some diving, some turning to meet the attack head-on. Jenkins picks a 109 that's trying to extend away to the east, probably hoping to gain separation, and then reverse into the Lightning's tail. It's a textbook move against a less experienced pilot, but Jenkins has over 800 hours in the P-38. He knows its strengths. He rolls into a shallow dive, accepting the temporary loss of altitude to build speed. The Lightning accelerates past 380 miles per hour. The Allison engines roar in their booms. The Messerschmitt is fast, but Jenkins is faster, and he's cutting the angle. At 800 yards, the German pilot realizes he's not going to escape. He brakes hard right, pulling his fighter into a tight turn, hoping the P-38 can't follow. It's a mistake. The Lightning's wide wingspan gives it a better turn rate at high speed than most pilots expect. Jenkins pulls lead. watches his gun sight track ahead of the 109's nose, and squeezes the trigger. 4 streams of 50 caliber tracers and a string of 20mm shells converge on the German fighter. Pieces of the 109's left wing tear away. The Messerschmitt rolls inverted and goes into a spin. Jenkins doesn't watch it fall. He's already scanning for the next threat. Around him, his squadron is engaged in a swirling dogfight that's bleeding altitude and scattering across 20 miles of sky. But the critical thing, the thing that proves the tactic works, is this. The German fighters are tied up here, 6 miles ahead of the bombers, burning fuel and ammunition on P-38s instead of organizing a coordinated attack on the B-17s. By the time the bomber stream reaches Oschersleben, the Luftwaffe's interception attempt has been disrupted. Some German fighters break off to attack the bombers directly, but they're disorganized, arriving in 1s and 2s instead of in the massed formations that made Schweinfurt so deadly. The close escort P-38s engage these stragglers. The bombers lose 4 aircraft, a painful number, but nothing like the catastrophic losses of previous raids. The 55th Fighter Group claims 7 German fighters destroyed for the loss of 2 P-38s, but the real victory isn't in the kill ratio, it's in the principle. Aggressive escort works. Within weeks, other P-38 groups are experimenting with similar tactics. Fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream become standard procedure. The P-38's range allows it to push deep into Germany, to loiter over known Luftwaffe airfields, to force the enemy to fight on American terms. German pilots begin to respect the Lightning, not because it's the best dogfighter in the sky, the P-51 Mustang will eventually take that title, but because it's always there, high and fast, looking for trouble. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force has 3 full P-38 groups operational in England. Together, they fly over 4,000 sorties per month. Bomber loss rates begin to decline. In January, the loss rate per mission was roughly 6%. By April, it's down to 3.5%. That difference, measured in human lives, means hundreds of airmen who come home instead of dying over Germany. If you're finding this tactical breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring you more deep dives into the innovations that changed the war. The P-38 isn't perfect. It's maintenance intensive. The turbo superchargers require constant care. In the cold air over Europe, engines still fail more often than pilots would like. The cockpit heating is inadequate, and pilots report frostbite on long missions. The twin-boom design, while distinctive and recognizable, also makes the aircraft vulnerable. A single burst from a cannon can sever one of the booms, and the P-38 becomes uncontrollable. But these flaws are balanced by advantages. The concentrated nose armament means that when a P-38 pilot hits his target, he hits it hard. The twin engines provide redundancy. Pilots nurse damaged Lightnings home on one engine when a single-engine fighter would have gone down. And the range, that precious combat radius that allows the P-38 to reach anywhere in the Third Reich, makes it irreplaceable in the months before the P-51 Mustang arrives in large numbers. German pilots develop their own tactics to counter the Lightning. They learn to attack from above, using their altitude advantage to build speed before engaging. They aim for the central nacelle, where the pilot sits exposed without the protection of an engine in front of him. They try to force the P-38 into high-speed dives where compressibility can lock up the controls. But these are reactive measures, born from necessity. The initiative has shifted. The Luftwaffe is no longer hunting at will over its own territory. It's fighting for survival. Not everyone in the Allied command structure embraces the aggressive escort doctrine. Some senior officers argue that scattering fighters across the sky in free-ranging sweeps leaves bombers vulnerable during critical moments of the mission. There are heated discussions at 8th Air Force headquarters. After one mission where a bomber group takes heavy losses while its assigned escort is 15 miles away chasing German fighters, a furious general threatens to ground the entire P-38 force. The debate comes down to philosophy. Is the fighter's primary job to shoot down enemy aircraft or to prevent bombers from being shot down? The distinction seems subtle, but it drives tactical decisions. Close escort prioritizes the second goal. Stay near the bombers. Be visible. Deter attacks. Aggressive escort prioritizes the first. Hunt the enemy. Force him to fight on your terms. Destroy his aircraft before they threaten the mission. The solution, as it often does, comes from compromise and careful analysis. Intelligence officers study mission reports, correlating fighter positions with bomber losses. They find that missions with aggressive forward escort generally see lower bomber casualties, provided that at least some fighters remain in close support. The optimal mix appears to be roughly 60% of the escort flying advanced sweeps, 40% staying tight with the bombers. This ratio becomes unofficial doctrine by spring 1944. P-38 groups refine their procedures. They coordinate with bomber groups before missions, establishing rally points and communication protocols. They use coded radio calls to relay German fighter positions. They develop the discipline to break off pursuit when fuel levels drop below a predetermined threshold, no matter how tempting the target. Lieutenant Thomas Griffin, flying with the 20th Fighter Group, experiences this discipline firsthand on a mission over Berlin in March. He's chasing a Focke-Wulf 190 that's damaged and trailing smoke, an easy kill if he can close the distance. His fuel gauge shows 160 gallons remaining, just above his bingo fuel, the minimum needed to reach the English coast. He closes to within 1,000 yards. The Focke-Wulf is right there. Then his flight leader's voice crackles over the radio, calm and firm, ordering all aircraft to break off and head west. Griffin reluctantly pulls away from the pursuit. He lands back in England with 30 gallons in his tanks, enough for perhaps 10 more minutes of flight. If he'd chased that Focke-Wulf another 5 minutes, he would have ditched in the North Sea. The aggressive escort doctrine works, but it's not bloodless. P-38 groups take heavy casualties in the spring of 1944. The 55th Fighter Group loses 23 pilots killed or missing in March alone. Some are shot down in dogfights deep over Germany. Some run out of fuel trying to make it home. Some crash in bad weather trying to find their bases in England's perpetual overcast. Each loss is a young man who trained for a year or more, who flew across the Atlantic, who believed he'd survive the war and go home. The math of attrition is cold. If a fighter group flies 30 missions per month and loses 3 pilots per mission on average, the entire group turns over in roughly 8 months. Some pilots beat the odds, some don't. The turnover creates constant pressure to train replacements, to integrate new pilots into experienced flights, to maintain unit cohesion when the roster changes every few weeks. The psychological toll is harder to quantify. Fighter pilots develop a fatalistic humor. They joke about the odds, about fuel gauges, about the peculiarities of the P-38. But underneath the jokes is the knowledge that every mission might be their last. Some pilots develop rituals, a specific sequence for pre-flight checks, a lucky coin in their pocket, a particular song they hum during the long flight over the North Sea. Others become superstitious about certain aircraft, refusing to fly tail numbers that have seen too many close calls. The Luftwaffe suffers its own attrition, worse than the Americans. German pilot training has been shortened to save time and fuel. New pilots arrive at frontline units with 150 hours of flight time, less than half what their American counterparts have. They're thrown into combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. The life expectancy of a German fighter pilot on the Western Front in 1944 is measured in weeks, not months. The Luftwaffe is bleeding to death, and the aggressive American escort tactics are tightening the tourniquet. While P-38s are proving themselves over Germany, the Lightning finds a different role in the Pacific. The long range that makes it valuable for bomber escort in Europe makes it essential for the vast distances of the Pacific theater. P-38s fly from New Guinea to strike targets in the Philippines, from island bases to escort bombers over Rabaul, from China to interdict Japanese shipping off the coast. In the Pacific, the P-38 becomes a legend. It's faster than the Japanese Zero at any altitude. It can outdive and outzoom any enemy fighter. And perhaps most importantly, the twin engines provide a margin of safety over an ocean where a forced landing means death. Pilots flying single-engine fighters over the Pacific know that an engine failure is usually fatal. P-38 pilots have a chance. The most famous American ace of the war, Richard Bong, flies the P-38 exclusively in the Pacific, scoring 40 confirmed kills. Thomas Maguire, the second-ranking American ace, also flies the Lightning. The aircraft becomes synonymous with American air power in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese pilots learn to respect the distinctive silhouette, the same way German pilots do in Europe. By summer 1944, the P-51 Mustang begins to arrive in England in large numbers. The Mustang has even longer range than the P-38, better high-altitude performance, and superior maneuverability. It's easier to maintain, less temperamental in cold weather, and cheaper to produce. The writing is on the wall. The P-51 will become the primary escort fighter for the 8th Air Force. But the P-38 doesn't disappear. Some groups continue to fly it through the end of the war. It remains valuable for ground attack missions, where its ruggedness and heavy armament make it effective against trains, vehicles, and airfields. It serves as a pathfinder aircraft, using radar to lead bomber formations through clouds to their targets. And it continues to fly escort missions, working alongside Mustangs and Thunderbolts in the massive fighter formations that sweep the skies over Germany in the final year of the war. The Lightning's greatest contribution isn't measured in kills or in missions flown. It's measured in the bomber crews who survived because aggressive fighter escort disrupted Luftwaffe attacks. It's measured in the tactical innovations that changed how fighters protected bombers. It's measured in the proof, paid for in blood and fuel, that long-range escort was possible, that bombers didn't have to fly alone into the teeth of enemy defenses. The story of the P-38 over Europe teaches several lessons that remain relevant decades later. First, doctrine isn't sacred. The close escort doctrine made sense based on the fighters available in 1942, but it needed to evolve when new aircraft changed what was possible. The willingness of pilots and commanders to question established procedures, to experiment under fire, saved lives. Second, range matters. The most maneuverable fighter in the world is useless if it can't reach the battle. The P-38's combat radius, more than any other single characteristic, made the aggressive escort doctrine viable. Strategic planners learned to prioritize range in future fighter designs. Third, trade-offs are inevitable. The P-38 was maintenance-intensive and temperamental. It had quirks that killed pilots, but it was available when it was needed, and it could do a job that no other fighter could do in late 1943 and early 1944. Waiting for the perfect aircraft would have meant more bombers lost, more crews dead. Sometimes good enough, right now, beats perfect later. Return to that April morning over France. Oberleutnant Dietrich sees the P-38 climbing toward his formation. He's an experienced pilot with over 60 combat missions. He knows the Lightning is dangerous at high altitude, fast in a dive, heavily armed. He also knows it's supposed to be clumsy in a turning fight, that its wide wingspan limits roll rate, that German pilots have shot them down before. He calls his wingman. They'll meet the attack together, 2 against 1, using their superior numbers and the Focke-Wulf's roll rate to get angles on the American. It should work. In theory, it should work. But the P-38 pilot doesn't engage the way Dietrich expects. Instead of pressing a head-on attack, the Lightning barrels past at high speed, climbing hard, then reverses from above. Dietrich tries to follow, but the American already has the altitude. And in the distance, Dietrich sees more contrails, more twin-boom shapes, a full squadron of P-38s positioning themselves between his formation and home. He makes the decision any rational pilot would make. He jettisons his external fuel tank, calls for his flight to disengage, and dives for the deck. They'll survive to fight another day, but they won't attack the bombers today. The bombers, distant silver specks still grinding toward their target, fly on unmolested. The P-38 Lightning didn't win the war alone. No single aircraft did, but it helped turn the tide at a critical moment when bomber losses were unsustainable and the strategic bombing campaign hung in the balance. It proved that aggressive tactics could work. It proved that fighter pilots could seize the initiative. And it proved that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is an aircraft that everyone said had too many compromises to succeed. The Luftwaffe learned to fear the twin-boom fighter, the bomber crews learned to trust it, and the doctrine writers learned that the book isn't always right. So here's a question for you. If you were a fighter pilot in 1944, would you rather fly close escort, staying near the bombers where your presence is reassuring but your effectiveness is limited? Or would you push ahead on aggressive sweeps, hunting the enemy but leaving the bombers temporarily unprotected? Drop your answer in the comments below.